All right, good morning, everyone. Today, what we're going to be doing some simple notes on the types of plate boundaries around the world, and kind of how those plate boundaries will give us the earthquakes and the volcanoes that we were looking at during the lab. So during the lab, we saw some new words that we might not have seen before, things like continental and divergent, in terms of plate boundaries. And what you should have noticed when you were working on that lab was that the earthquakes and the volcanoes around the world didn't just happen randomly and don't just happen everywhere. They happen in very specific areas and regions around the world. And where those earthquakes and volcanoes happen are at the plate boundaries of the Earth. Okay, so today what we're going to be looking at are those convergent means coming together, and the divergent plate boundaries around the Earth. So again, convergent are two objects moving together, divergent, two objects moving apart. Okay. Before we get into the plate boundaries, first we need to understand what the plates are, okay, and why these plates are so important to the the regions of the Earth where people live on these plate boundaries. We're going to be looking at a lot of plate boundaries today. If you live on a plate boundary, your life's going to be a little bit more crazy than if you live here in New York. Okay. So remember, as we're going through this, make sure you're taking notes. You can take notes either on your iPad or on a piece of loose leaf, but you will be uploading them to Schoology when you're done here. All right. Before we jump into it, we do have a couple of definitions. The first definition is just the idea of plate tectonics. Plate tectonics is the theory that the Earth's lithosphere, so this is a theory, that the Earth's lithosphere, remember lithosphere, we did our layers of the Earth last week. The lithosphere is that topmost, it's almost a shell of the Earth. The Earth's lithosphere is made up of many large pieces that move over the asthenosphere. And again, if you remember from last week, the asthenosphere is that second layer. It's the layer that the lithosphere is on top of. So if we were to dig down about 50 to 100 miles, we would hit the asthenosphere. Okay. And the tectonic plate, in the idea of plate tectonics, the Earth is made up of all of these plates. An individual plate is called a tectonic plate. And these are the large chunks of the lithosphere. And these pieces move, and they move independent from one another. And when these plates collide, so when they run into each other, we get earthquakes. And when they move apart, we'll get volcanoes. And what you can see here, down here on the bottom, we've got all of these plates in different colors. And in between all of these plates is that solid black line. Along these solid black lines, these are going to be areas that are going to be much more prone to earthquakes and volcanoes than anywhere else on the world. So if we look here, over here on the western part of the United States, we've got a plate boundary. And what do you know about California? California tends to get a lot of earthquakes, not so many volcanoes, but California gets many, many earthquakes. And that has to do with the type of plate boundary we have here in California. Okay. You can also see another version of that map in your reference table. On page 5 of your reference table, you'll see this map. And on this map, we're going to see many, many different symbols. So here we have a symbol here for divergent. And you can see we have arrows here showing that divergent means to move apart. And we can see that here we got a lot of these divergent boundaries all over the world. And you might notice that most of these divergent boundaries, are they on land? Are they in water? It looks like we see most of them in the ocean. We also see our convergent plate boundaries here, which I'm going to highlight in green, and these have our arrows coming towards each other. So here we have many, many convergent boundaries all around the world. And what we often find with convergent boundaries is we get mountains and we get volcanoes. Okay, and we're going to be looking at that in just a few minutes. Okay, so our plates move, right? We established in this definition here, our tectonic plates are pieces of the lithosphere that move. So if they move, that means the Earth must have looked different than it does now. And here we see a picture here of the Earth about 250 million years ago. Okay, 250 million. This is before the dinosaurs were around. Right when the dinosaurs were starting to evolve, we had this supercontinent. Now, this supercontinent, you might have heard of it before, is called Pangea. Okay, and Pangea is I think it's Latin. It means pan is all and Gea is earth. So Pangea was just a word that they used to describe all of the earth. All of the earth was together as one giant, we call it a supercontinent. You know, now we have 7 continents. Back then, there was just one continent, and that continent was known as Pangea. Okay, our continents move. They come together, they move apart. Guess what? They're going to go together again. Okay. When we're talking about plate boundaries, we talk about the motion of the objects and the relative motion of the objects. And the relative motion is the motion of two objects in relationship to one another. So we really have 3 types of relative motion. Okay, we have motion that's moving towards. Right? If you think about it, you've got if you play football or if you've ever seen a football game, you know, right on the line, you have relative motion towards each other. You have the 2 sides of opposing linemen basically running straight into each other. So that's towards relative motion. It's 2 objects going towards one another. Alternatively, we have away from. Okay, away from are just 2 objects running away from each other. Okay, and then finally is alongside. So one object moving this way to the right and another object moving this way to the left, they don't run into each other. They're just kind of moving by each other, kind of like traffic on a road. You know, one side's going to the right, the other side's going to the left. They shouldn't be colliding, they shouldn't be running into each other, but they're going in opposite directions. All right. And these 3 motions actually have different names. We don't just call them towards or away from. We call this towards motion convergent. Okay, and we call this away from motion divergent. Divergent means to move away. To diverge is to move away. To converge is to come together. So convergent is coming together. Moving away is divergent. Divergement. Sorry about that. Okay, we got divergent. And then alongside each other is transform. Okay, these are the 3 types of motion that we'll talk about today.